All right, class, welcome back to your daily read aloud, My Side of the Mountain. And we are ready for a new chapter, which is called I Have a Good Look at Winter and Find Spring in the Snow. But before we start, let's review what happened last time. Angie, get us started.
His dad left, and I was kind of surprised that he didn't want to take him home. What?
Okay, so before that, I know Abby was gone. Remember last time you were here, when we stopped reading, someone was yelling like, I know you're up there. So that was his dad. So his dad came to visit for Christmas. So it was Bando, Sam, and his dad. They had a good time together. And we were wondering if Sam's dad was going to make him go home, if he was going to be mad. And how did he seem to feel about Sam being there? Cadence?
I wouldn't say he was happy, but...
Yeah, he was kind of...
Proud.
a little bit proud, right? Like, I'm glad you've made it. I can't believe you've done this. Was he going to make him go home?
No.
Eric?
No, because
No?
he said he has a better life right here instead of outside the real world.
Yeah. His dad actually said, I'm jealous of you, son, right? I work all day from sunup to sundown feeding all these kids, working hard to have my house. And he said, I think you've got a better life here. So that is where we ended. Dad went home, and now Sam's left by himself for the first time in a while.
Wait, not by himself. He's with...
Well, he still has Frightful, but he's by himself, the only person, for a while. All right. With Christmas over, the winter became serious. The snows deepened, the wind blew, the temperatures dropped until the air snapped and talked. That's some good personification, right? It's almost that cold right now, isn't it? The air can almost snap and talk, it's so cold. Never had humanity seemed so far away as it did in those cold, still months of January, February, and March. I wandered the snowy crags, listening to the language of the birds by day and to the noises of the weather by night. The wind howled, the snow avalanched, and the air creaked. I slept, ate, played my reed whistle, and talked to Frightful. To be relaxed, warm, and part of the winter wilderness is an unforgettable experience. I was in excellent condition. Not a cold, not a sniffle, not a moment of fatigue. I enjoyed the feeling that I could eat, sleep, and be warm, and outwit the storms that blasted the mountains and the sub-zero temperatures that numbed them. It snowed on. I plowed through drifts and stamped paths until eventually it occurred to me that I had all the materials to make snowshoes for easier traveling. Here are the snowshoe notes. I made slats. Now, when he talks about a slat, that's just kind of like a thin piece of wood. Okay, so he's making little pieces of wood. I made slats out of ash saplings. So an ash is a type of tree, and a sapling means it's a small tree. So it's kind of still bendable. It's not a huge, big tree. I whittled them thin enough to bow. I soaked them in water to make them bend more easily, looped the two ends together, and wound them with hide. With my penknife, I made holes an inch apart all around the loop. I strung deer hide crisscross through the loops. I made a loop of hide to hold my toe and straps to tie the shoes on. When I first walked in these shoes, I tripped on my shoes and fell, or my toes and fell. But by the end of the first day, I could walk from the tree to the gorge in half the time. So if you don't know what snowshoes are, they are really wide wooden things that you stand on top of. You strap them to your feet, kind of like a ski, but they're big circle shapes. And it spreads your weight out, so when you step on the snow, you don't sink down through it. You stay on the top of it. So the reason our feet like to go down through the snow is because all of our weight are on the bottoms of our feet, like that big of a space, right? So if you spread it out over a big space, you can kind of stay on the top of the snow. Emma?
My brother's going skiing
Really?
next week, I think.
So skis also, when you're skiing, do your feet sink under the snow with your skis on? Or do you stay on top? Stay on the top. If your skis went way under, you wouldn't be able to slide down the mountain. Not Emma, Madeline.
When we were watching Breakthrough, the person when the other guy was drowning, they got the one guy out, and then he had to crawl because if you have all the weight on one place, then it will just break. But then if you have weight in different places, then it won't. And then so he had to crawl, and that's probably the same with the snowshoes because then it has more space to.
Yep, it spreads your weight out. So here's just a cool fact. We cannot start talking about ice and things about it, but I'll tell you this quick fact. I grew up around the lakes up north, so here's a cool fact. If you're ever on the ice, and you should never be on ice unless you are with an adult who knows how to check it for safety. But if you are on ice and you ever start to hear it crack, First of all, that'd be terrifying, and I hope to never be in that position. But there is something you can do to increase your chances of getting off the ice without falling through. If you are standing and have all your weight on your 2 feet, do you think that's going to make the ice break faster?
Yeah.
How could you position yourself to spread your weight? Quentin?
Like lay down or something.
Yep. Lay out like a starfish, okay? And then can you kind of shuffle your way to shore best you can? If you spread all your weight out, you have less chance of breaking through, okay? So that's just a fun fact, real quick.
If you're ever on the ice and if people are right next to you and you're here correct, you all want to spread out.
Right, because if you all stay together, all that weight's on the same spot. Good thinking. Okay, so he's got his snowshoes. I lived close to the weather. It is surprising how you watch it when you live in it. Not a cloud passed unnoticed. Not a wind blew untested. I knew the moods of the storms, where they came from, their shapes and colors. When the sun shone, I took Frightful to the meadow, and we slid down the mountain on my snapping turtle shell sled. How cool would that be? Snapping turtles are large enough you could get a shell and sit in it, so he made himself a sled. Frightful really didn't care much for this, so Frightful did not like sledding. When the winds changed and the air smelled like snow, I would stay in my tree because I had gotten lost in a blizzard one afternoon and had to hole up on a rock ledge until I could see where I was going. That day the winds were so strong I could not push against them, so I crawled under the ledge, and for hours I wondered if I would be able to dig out when the storm blew on. Fortunately, I only had to push through about a foot of snow. However, that taught me to stay home when the air said snow. Not that I was afraid of being caught far from home in a storm, for I could find food and shelter and make a fire anywhere. But I'd become as attached to my hemlock house as a brooding bird to her nest. Caught out in the storms and weather, I had an urgent desire to return to my tree, even as the bear and weasel returned to his den and the deer to their copse. We all had our little patch in the wilderness. We all I am super distracted for some reason today. We all fought to return there. So do you think to animals, their burrows or where they nest at night feels kind of like our rooms at home or our beds? Yeah, it makes you feel comfortable.
And when will it? It's like how he's experiencing. We're kind of experiencing what he's experiencing because we have not had like a day where it hasn't snowed yet.
I know, we're going to have a snowy week. So this does kind of help us think about what it's like for Sam on the mountain. All right. Okay, he doesn't like to be out of his tree. Lost my spot. Okay, he's attached to it. Okay. I usually came home at night with the nuthatches that roosted in the nearby sapling. I knew I was late if I tapped the tree and he came out. Sometimes, when the weather was icy and miserable, I would hear him high in the tree near the edge of the meadow, yanking and flicking his tail. And then I would see him wing to bed early. I considered him to be a pretty good barometer. And if he went to his tree early, I went to mine early too. A barometer is a science instrument that measures pressure in the air. So a barometer, sometimes you'll see it next to a temperature thermometer. Like on someone's fancy wall, they might have some stuff like that. So a barometer tells you things about air pressure. So when you get older, you'll learn how you can predict future weather by watching the air pressure. All right. So that nuthatch, if he goes to bed early, Sam thinks, oh, he knows something's coming. I'm going to go to bed now too. When you don't have a newspaper or radio to give you weather bulletins, watch the birds and animals. They can tell you when the storm's coming. I called the nuthatch barometer, and when he holed up, I holed up. Lit my light and sat by my fire whittling or learning new tunes on my reed whistle. I was now really into the teeth of winter and quite fascinated by its activity. There is no such thing as a still winter night. Not only are many animals running around in the creaking cold, but the trees cry out and limbs snap and fall, and the wind gets caught in a ravine and screams until it dies. One noisy night, I put this down. There is somebody in my bedroom. I can hear small exchanges of greetings and little feet moving up the wall. By the time I get to my light, all is quiet. The next day, there was something in my room last night. A small tunnel leads out from my door into the snow. It is a marvelous tunnel, neatly packed, and it goes from a dried fern to a clump of moss. Then it turns and disappears. I would say mouse. and then that night. I kept an ember glowing and got a light fast before the visitor could get to the door. It was a mouse, a perfect little white-footed deer mouse with enormous black eyes and tidy white feet. Caught in the act of intruding, he decided not to retreat, but came toward me a few steps. I handed him a nut meat. He took it in his fragile paws, stuffed it in his cheek, flipped, and went out of his secret tunnel. No doubt that tunnel leads right over to my store tree, and this fellow is having a fat winter. So, is this guy eating all his food? Yeah. There were no raccoons or skunks out in the snow, but the mice, the weasels, the mink, the foxes, the shrews, the cottontail rabbits were all busier than Coney Island in July. Their tracks were all over the mountain, and their activities ranged from catching each other to hauling various materials back to their dens and burrows for more insulation. By day, the birds were a wing. They got up late, after I did, and would call to each other before hunting. I would stir up my fire and think about how much food it must take to keep one little bird alive in that fierce cold. They must eat and eat and eat, I thought. Once, however, I came upon a male cardinal sitting in a hawthorn bush. It was a miserable day, gray, damp, and somewhere around the 0 mark. The cardinal wasn't doing anything at all, just sitting on a twig, all fluffed up, keeping himself warm. Now there's a wise bird, I said to myself. He is conserving his energy. None of this flying around looking for food and wasting effort. As I watched him, he shifted his feet twice, standing on one and pulling the other up into his warm feathers. I'd often wondered why birds' feet didn't freeze, and there was my answer. He even sat down on both of them and let his warm feathers cover them like little socks, which I think is adorable. January 8th. I took Frightful out today. We went over to the meadow to catch a rabbit for her. As we passed one of the hemlocks near the edge of the grove, she pulled her feathers to her body and looked alarmed. I tried to find out what had frightened her, but saw nothing. On the way back, we passed the same tree, and I noticed an owl pellet cast in the snow. Does anyone know what an owl pellet is? Josiah?
It's sad, but it's like a part of a bird that an owl ate.
So the pellet, I'll go over this really fast. I can't do questions or anything, but an owl pellet, so when an owl eats, we remember from Mrs. Frisbee, they like to eat things like mice. So I'll use a mouse as an example. It could also be a smaller bird, sometimes a frog.
Okay.
But owls eat things like that. So when they eat a bird or a mouse, do owls have teeth?
Nope.
No.
Angie?
The beak
They have a beak, right? No teeth.
and talons.
So when you eat a mouse, if you're an owl, you can't chew it, right? And do they eat the entire animal?
No, not the bones.
Think about it.
No.
When an owl catches a bird or a little mouse and swallows it, they do eat the whole animal. So this is what happens. Obviously, there's bones and things inside that you can't digest. So what owls do, they will eat the whole thing. Their body sorts out the stuff they can't have, like the fur and the feathers or the bones and all that. And then they will regurgitate, which is kind of like throw up, this little, they call it a pellet. All it is all that extra stuff they can't digest. They just kind of,
In a bowl.
it's like, it kind of looks like a cat hairball, if anyone's ever seen a cat hairball. And it's kind of the same idea, right? They can't digest that hair. They got to cough it back up. So owls cough this up, and we will see at the end of this year, we might take a look at a couple owl pellets. But people will take them apart with tools, and you can figure out what that owl was eating based on what's in the pellet. So some people will say it has something to do with owl poop. Nope. Okay, it comes out of its mouth. All right, so they found an owl pellet. Why would this cause Frightful to be on high alert? Eric?
Because owl and but
Do you think owls and falcons get along really great?
no,
Probably not. They go after the same prey.
yeah, but I think Frightful would catch the owl because she's the fastest bird.
Frightful is one of the most powerful hunting birds. So we will see. All right.
This is here. Is Frightful still a baby or is she grown?
She's grown. She's big. All right. Today after this, those of you at home, you should look up a peregrine falcon. I'll show them one too. But that's a picture of her on the front of the book. But I'll show you what they look like in real life. All right. Let's keep reading here. So on the way back, Frightful's freaking out. They passed the same tree. I noticed an owl pellet cast in the snow. I looked up. There were lots of limbs in darkness, but I could not see the owl. I walked around the tree. Frightful stared at one spot until I thought her head would swivel off. I looked, and there it was, looking like a broken limb, a great horned owl. I must say, I was excited to have such a neighbor. I hit the tree with a stick and he flew off. Those great wings, they must have been 5 feet across. They beat the wind, but there was no sound. The owl steered down the mountain through the tree limbs, and somewhere, not far away, he vanished in the needles and limbs. It is really very special to have a horned owl. I guess I feel this way because he is such a wilderness bird. He needs lots of forests and big trees, and so his presence means that the Gribbly farm is a beautiful place indeed. Hayden?
Sometimes you can actually hear geese, if they're close enough, you can sometimes hear the geese's wings flap.
You can. And if you're ever around swans, we have swans up by the lakes where I came from. When they fly their wings, trumpeter swans' wings make a really crazy sound. So when you hear them, you almost think they're making it with their mouth, but they're not. It's their wings. So
That's how loud it is.
I will read a little bit more, but we have got to move on to our other book here soon. We've chatted too much today. We will read that when we get to it. All right, last page. One week, the weather gave a little to the sun, and snow melted and limbs dumped their loads and popped up into the air. I thought I'd try to make an igloo. I was cutting big blocks of snow and putting them in a circle. Frightful was dozing with her face in the sun, and the tree sparrows were raiding the hemlock cones. I worked and hummed and did not notice the gray sheet of cloud that was sneaking up the mountain from the northwest. It covered the sun suddenly. I realized the air was damp enough to ring. I could stay as warm as a bug if I didn't get wet. So I looked at the drab mess in the sky, whistled for Frightful, and started back to the tree. We holed up just as Barometer was yanking his way home, and it was none too soon. It drizzled, it misted, it sprinkled, and finally, it froze. The deer-hide door grew stiff with ice as darkness came, and it rattled like a piece of tin when the wind hit it. So we'll stop there. So he is going to have his first ice storm. Did we recently just have a small ice storm? Okay, so what do you think is going to be challenging for Sam living on the top of a mountain in a tree after an ice storm? And remember, ice storms in the mountains, you might have that much ice on everything. So we have ice storms, we have a little bit, but they might have a lot. Eric?
He might have to get like a ton of food in his thing in his house, so he doesn't have the thing or not not freeze to death.
Okay.
To survive, or he has to get his ratchet and break the ice in front of it.
Okay, so he might have to break himself even out of his tree house, right? Cadence, what do you think?
If it's not that cold, if he has a really big coat, it would be still hard for him to go ice fishing.
Yeah, so he might want to have his food ready before it gets here, right? Which is now. Josiah? Okay. Hayden?
What page are we on?
Oh, I don't know. I already closed my book. Angie?
I have 2 things.
Real quick.
Some ice is really strong or really heavy.
Yes.
That sometimes it can break off a branch or even the whole tree. And
Have any of you thought about that?
And it's frightful too. It's probably going to be too cold and her wings are going to freeze.
Okay, so they might have to stay in the tree the whole time, right? Okay, so that's what I wanted you to think about. When I just had the ice storm at my house last week, we did lose a big limb. So not huge, it wasn't a huge tree, but it did snap the limb off. So you guys know, usually water, if it's raining, does water pile up on top of the branches?
Yeah.
Think about that. Can I have like an inch of loose water on top of my tree branch?
No.
It falls off, right? So when ice is frozen, though, we can have that much. So that's why when you have a bad ice storm, sometimes your tree limbs will almost look like they're hanging low because they're heavy. Josiah? Never mind. All right. Moving on to the Beatles. We finished reading about all 4 of the guys. So the last chapter we read was very short about George Harrison. And we did say that he had a much happier life than the other 3 guys. But what was one thing that he struggled with as a kid? Because there was one thing. Josiah?
He didn't talk a lot.
He was very shy. So to some of you, it might be like, well, that's not a struggle, but it can be. When I was younger, I was way shy right when I met people, to the point where I would just kind of sit and be quiet. And it's way better when people talk and share their ideas, right? So he was very, very shy. So we talked about how that might have made it hard for him when they got really famous, because he had to still deal with all those people. All right. It's about time I put a bookmark in here. All right, chapter 5. This one's called Forming the Band. And that's all we'll have time for today. When the Beatles were growing up, there was no MTV, no iTunes. There wasn't even radio stations that played rock and roll. In fact, when the Beatles were small boys, rock and roll didn't even exist. Shh. Okay, I need everyone that's not listening right now to quit that and listen. In the United States, there was a style of music that had the same energy as rock. It was called rhythm and blues. Black people invented that kind of music. And we talked a little bit about some of the jazz musicians that played a lot of different trumpets and horns and guitars. Some of them had some more dance and rhythm. And it was, I want to say, happier music, right? You guys understand that difference in the feeling of the music? It made you want to dance and have fun. But in the early 1950s, DJs wouldn't play their music on the radio. Why do you think DJs, and this really happened, in the 1950s, why wouldn't DJs play any music that black people made that became popular? What do you think? Alex? Okay. Hayden?
Because the segregation.
All right. We've talked a lot about that, right? Even after slavery ended and all the laws changed, were there still a lot of people that made terrible choices and treated people badly? Yeah, there still are, right? We've talked about this a lot this year. So, like we said, if no one would play your music on the radio, you couldn't go find it on the internet. There was really no other way to listen, right? So, for the 4 young boys in England, there was no chance to hear the music that had become rock and roll. Instead, they were stuck listening to white people perform what came to be called bubblegum pop. It also came from the United States. These were happy, harmless songs that were easy to sing. Parents liked them. Okay, here's an example of this, guys. Now, this might sound like a nursery rhyme to you now, but back in this time period, this would have been your coolest song to play on the radio. You ready to hear? How much is that doggy in the window? You guys ever heard that? It's like a rhyme. Like, how much is that doggy in the window? I'm not going to sing the whole thing, but it's not great. I'll just say it's not great, okay? So how much was that doggy in the window was a big hit in 1953. It didn't make grown-ups feel uncomfortable. But then, in the mid-1950s, music companies started to ask white singers to perform rhythm and blues. That's when rock and roll was born. And I've always kind of had a problem with that. Who did they let start playing the rhythm and blues on the radio? Josiah?
The white people.
Yeah. Does anyone else think that does not seem fair at all? Yeah. Like, they didn't come up with that type of music. They hadn't made it their own, and they were the ones that got a lot of credit. So when you hear of rhythm and blues music, that all came from black musicians. And, you know, everyone likes to share music. It's not wrong for someone else to play their music, but I think they should have got more credit. All right. So rock and roll was born in the 1950s. Okay, this page is all about rhythm and blues. So it's kind of like a sidebar, okay? And we're going to read about Ray Charles. Have any of you heard of Ray Charles? A little bit? Okay, he's a famous guy. You'll hear of him the older you get. Here is his picture. All I want you to notice, he's playing with sunglasses on.
He's blind.
Okay, so he is blind. Okay, so let's hear about Ray Charles. Before rock and roll came rhythm and blues. In fact, the rock music made in the 1950s sounded almost the same as the rhythm and blues that had been playing in clubs for years. The big difference is that rhythm and blues was created by African Americans. These black singers took songs that were once country, blues, or big band music and made them great to dance to. They shouted, they sang fast, they banged on the piano. Sadly, even 100 years after the Civil War, black people in America were treated unfairly. Rhythm and blues singers could play clubs, but they couldn't get their songs played on the radio. The music companies came up with an idea. What if they had white singers record black people's songs? It wasn't fair, but it worked. Elvis Presley sang Roy Brown's Good Rockin' Tonight, and Bill Haley did Big Joe Turner's Shake, Rattle, and Roll. So, rock and roll was born. As for black rock music, in the late 1950s, a black record company named Motown started producing music by black groups. Some of them, like the Supremes and the Temptations, became very famous. The Motown sound was played on radio stations across the country and made stars out of the singers. And you'll learn a lot more about Motown the older you get. Did you have any of that in your book?
I don't know actually, but there was this show, and it's called Motown Magic, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then my sister has a microphone about all these songs that were like kind of jazz and from a long time ago.
Yeah, so Motown's really cool. If you like the early rock and roll sound, you'll want to look up Motown. And it was ran by African Americans for African Americans, so they finally got their spot in the spotlight, which they had deserved for a long time. All right. 2 more pages. All right, back to our actual story. Rock's first hit came from a man named Bill Haley. It was a song called Rock Around the Clock. Kids liked it because you could sing and dance to it. Plus, it was used in a popular movie at the time, Blackboard Jungle. Then came Elvis Presley. Everyone, including John and Paul, wanted to be just like Elvis. John's band, the Quarrymen, got its name from his school, Quarry Bank. The Quarrymen played their first gig in the summer of 1957. That was also when Paul saw John's band play at a local church. It was a warm summer day. John stood up on a stage with his guitar and sang. Paul was very impressed by what he heard. He went up to John after the show and said that he also played music. Then he grabbed someone else's guitar and played a song to prove it. John was just as impressed by what he had heard. He wanted to ask Paul to join his band, although he worried that fans would like Paul more. Isn't that kind of funny? Even people like the Beatles worry about that. So John Lennon had his own band, and he thought, well, if I let Paul join me, people might like him better than me. Well, maybe people did, okay? But, you know, it's kind of fun just to think famous people have those same fears and anxieties all the rest of us do. But John decided that Paul would help the band. They played their first show together in October. After the gig, Paul showed John the song he wrote after his mother died. John went home and wrote a song of his own called Hello Little Girl. Do you think they both connected right there when they realized both of their moms had died? Yeah. It was later that winter that Paul took his new friend George to meet John. George was only 15 at the time. Too young, thought John, to be in the band. John was 18. But Paul convinced John to let George in. Now, all they needed was a drummer. At first, they found a drummer named Colin, but he quit after a fight with John and Paul. Then, drummer number 2, Tommy Moore, had to leave the band because his girlfriend wanted him to get a paying job. Imagine that, making money at your job. He went to work in a bottle factory. Then they took on a guy named Pete Best, who was the son of a local club owner. Finally, they wanted to bring on a bass player. A bass looks like a guitar, but it plays only the low notes. A bass line. Its job is to keep the beat of the song. John convinced one of his friends, Stu Sutcliffe, to take up bass so he could join. Stu bought a bass guitar and tried to learn how to play it. He didn't stay around very long, but he did do one important thing. It was his idea to change the band's name from the Quarrymen. In February 1960, the band was renamed The Beatles. The name had nothing to do with the bug. It was because their music had such a strong beat. So, I actually, my entire childhood, thought they were called the Beatles because of the bug.
Yeah.
Okay? It's because you've got a good beat. Okay? So they're the Beatles. All right? So we are going to stop there. Chapter 6 is called A New Name, A New Look. And friends at home, I will see you tomorrow. Have a great day.
Bye.
And stay warm.